Marin Whitlow pressed her last coin into the station master's palm and watched him shake his head. Behind her, her 3 children stood in the biting cold of Red Bluff's main street, coatless, silent, too hungry even to cry. She had nothing, no money, no husband waiting, no plan. And the only man who had promised her a future lay cold in the ground before she ever set eyes on him. She squared her jaw, took her youngest by the hand, and walked forward because there was nowhere left to go but forward. If this story already has you holding your breath, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single chapter. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The telegram had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone soft, the ink smearing at the corners where Marin's fingers always found it in the dark. She didn't need to read it anymore. She had every word memorized the way a person memorizes the thing that breaks them, not by choice, but by repetition. Regret to inform. Jeremiah Crow, deceased, November 14th, 14 words. That was all it took to undo 8 months of letters of careful hope of packing and planning and telling her children that yes, things were going to be different now. Better. She had promised them better. The train had deposited them in Red Bluff, just as the afternoon light was bleeding out of the sky, and the cold had come down fast and mean the way it always did in these high country towns. Marin had stood on the platform, with Clara pressed against her left side, and Thomas pressed against her right, and little Nora strapped to her back in the worn carrier she'd sewn herself, and she had looked at the town laid out before her and understood in the deep, wordless way that exhausted people understand things that she was in trouble. Real trouble. The kind that didn't announce itself with drama. The kind that just settled in quietly and waited. She had 43 cents. She had 3 children ages 7, 5, and 18 months. She had a carpet bag with 2 changes of clothes for each of them and a small tin of hard biscuits she'd rationed across the 2-day train ride. The biscuits were gone. The 43 cents were not enough for a room. She knew no one in Red Bluff. The one person she had been supposed to know was in the ground. Clara tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, is this where we live now?" Marin looked down at her oldest. Clara had her father's serious gray eyes and her mother's stubborn mouth, and she was looking up at Marin with the particular expression of a 7-year-old, who already understands that adults sometimes lie to protect you, and who is deciding in this moment whether she wants the lie or the truth. "We're going to figure it out," Marin said. Clara studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded, took Thomas's hand, without being asked, and that was that. They walked. Marin didn't have a destination, just forward motion, because standing still felt like giving up. Red Bluff was a decent-sized town, bigger than she'd expected from Jeremiah's letters, with a main street that stretched long and lamplit storefronts, shuttered for the evening, but a few establishments still showing light and warmth through their windows. There was a general store, a livery, a barber, a land office, a saloon at the far end that she steered the children away from out of instinct. And, in the middle of the block, a small restaurant, Hattie's Supper Table, the sign read, from which drifted the smell of something warm and savory that hit Marin in the stomach like a physical blow. She stopped walking without deciding to stop. Thomas looked up at her. "Mama." "Give me a minute," she said, and she was talking to herself more than to him. Through the window, she could see maybe a dozen people at tables. The warm amber light of oil lamps. A woman in an apron moving between them with plates. Her children hadn't had a hot meal since the morning they left Missouri. Nora had been fussing on and off for hours, the restless, unhappy fussing of a baby who doesn't know the word for hungry but knows the feeling of it. Marin shifted her weight on her back and pressed her lips together. She could go in and ask. She had 43 cents, which wasn't enough for 4 meals, but might be enough to buy the children something small, a bowl of whatever that smell was, split 3 ways. She could do that. She would not think about what came after. She would think about the next 10 minutes and nothing else. She pushed the door open. The warmth hit her like a wall, and for just a second she went still in the doorway. her eyes adjusting to the lamplight, Nora making a soft, surprised sound against her back. A few people glanced up. Most looked away. Marin stepped inside and let the door close behind her. The woman in the apron, Hattie Marine assumed, appeared from behind the counter, with the expression of someone who has seen a great deal and holds strong opinions about most of it. She was a sturdy woman in her 60s, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that could go either way. "Help you," she said. "I'd like to get something for my children," Marin said. She kept her voice even. She was good at keeping her voice even. It was a skill she had developed over 3 years of being a widow in a world that did not make much room for widows. "I have 43 cents. I know that isn't much. Whatever it will buy." Hattie looked at Clara, looked at Thomas, craned slightly to look at the baby on Marin's back. Her expression shifted in a way Marin couldn't quite read. 43 cents buys a bowl of beans and cornbread," Hattie said. "One bowl. Can I split it between the 3 of them?" "You can do whatever you like with it." Hattie turned away. "Find a seat." Marin settled the children at a table near the door, close enough to the exit that they didn't take up much space, far enough from the other diners that they wouldn't disturb anyone. She unstrapped Nora and held her against her chest, the baby immediately grabbing at Marin's collar with both fists. Thomas was watching everything with enormous, interested eyes. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, the way Marin had taught her, and Marin felt a wave of something almost too painful to name, pride and grief, all twisted together, looking at her daughter's careful dignity. She was aware of the looks. She was always aware of the looks. She had been getting them since Daniel died, and she'd had to go to the church and the neighbors, and eventually the county office with her hat in her hands, so to speak. The widow look. The woman alone look. The look that assessed and categorized and filed her away as someone else's problem. She ignored it the way she always ignored it. A bowl of beans arrived, and cornbread, and Marin broke the bread into 3 pieces and distributed the bowl between Clara and Thomas, keeping a small portion back to mash soft for Nora. Clara ate without comment. Thomas ate with the focused intensity of a 5-year-old who has been hungry for too long. Marin ate nothing and told herself she wasn't hungry. She was very hungry. She was sitting there running through her options, which were few, and none of them good, when she became aware that someone at the next table was watching her. Not the brief assessing glance she'd been getting since she walked in. A steady, unhurried attention. She looked up. The man was maybe 10 years older than her, somewhere in his mid-40s, lean and dark, with the particular kind of stillness that came from spending a great deal of time outdoors and alone. He wore a plain work shirt and a dark vest, a hat resting on the table beside his plate. He had dark eyes and the tanned, weathered face of a man who worked cattle, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not pity. She would have bristled at pity, and was not the calculating look of a man assessing a woman's usefulness. It was just attention, steady and plain. "You waiting on someone?" he said. His voice was quiet, not carrying across the room, meant just for her. "No," Marin said. "You look like you've had a hard day." "I've had a hard several months," she said more honestly than she intended. "But thank you for the observation." One corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Caleb Yazzie," he said. "Marin Whitlow." He looked at the children, then back at her. Then he looked at the bowl they were sharing and at her empty hands. He didn't say anything about it. He just picked up his own plate. It held a full supper, roasted meat and potatoes and greens barely touched, and set it down on the table in front of her. Marin stared at it. Then she looked at him. "I can't take your supper," she said. "You're not taking it. I'm giving it." "That's the same thing." "It ain't actually." He leaned back in his chair, easy and unhurried, as if this were an ordinary conversation. "Taking is when you do something without permission. I'm giving it with full permission. Those are different things." "You haven't eaten." "I'm not all that hungry." He said it simply, without the particular forced casualness that would have made it a lie. "And you are." "So." Marin looked at the plate for a long moment. Nora made a small sound in her lap and grabbed at the edge of the table. Thomas had gone very still, watching the plate the way children watch things they want, but have been taught not to ask for. Her pride was a real and present thing. It had kept her upright through 3 years of hard circumstances, and she was not inclined to set it down lightly. But her children were hungry. She pulled the plate toward her and ate. She ate steadily and without rushing, because rushing would have felt desperate, and she refused to feel desperate in front of strangers. She ate enough to feel like herself again, and she fed small bites to Nora, and she watched Thomas eye the remaining potatoes until she pushed the plate toward him without comment. Caleb Yazzie said nothing. He sat with his coffee and looked at something in the middle distance, giving her the privacy of his inattention, which was more thoughtful than most people managed. When the plate was clean, Marin straightened her spine and looked at him directly. "Thank you," she said. "I'll pay you back." "You don't need to." "I will," she said, and her voice had an edge to it that she hadn't intended and did not apologize for. "I pay my debts, Mr. Yazzie." He looked at her, then really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted into something like respect. "All right," he said. "Fair enough. We came to Red Bluff because I was—" She stopped, swallowed. "I had an arrangement with a man named Jeremiah Crow, a business arrangement. He passed before I arrived." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I heard Crow died," he said. "Didn't know he had family coming." "Not family. I didn't know him personally. We corresponded. He needed a housekeeper and I needed work. I brought my children because he said there was room." She said it plainly, without shame, because there was nothing to be ashamed of. And yet she felt the familiar brace of a woman explaining herself to a world that will judge anyway. "I understand the situation I'm in. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm trying to work out my next step. Do you have a place to stay?" The question landed between them. Marin met his eyes. "No," she said. He nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already worked out. He turned and raised a hand, and Hattie appeared from behind the counter with the expression of a woman who has been watching this entire exchange and forming opinions. "Leona got a room open?" Caleb asked her. Hattie's eyes moved to Marin, to the children, back to Caleb. "She might." "Tell her I'll cover the first week." "You don't have to," Marin began. "It's a loan," he said, looking at her steadily. "You pay your debts. You said so yourself." She wanted to argue. She could feel the argument right there, the one about pride and charity, and the difference between the two, the one she'd made to herself 100 times in the past 3 years. But Clara was leaning against her arm, half asleep, and Thomas had his head down on the table, and Nora had finally gone quiet in her lap, and the fight just wasn't in her tonight. "Alone," she said. "Alone," he agreed. Leona Marsh's rooming house was 3 blocks from Hattie's, a solid 2-story frame building that smelled of lye soap and old wood and something baking, which turned out to be a pan of sweet rolls Leona had just pulled from the oven when they arrived. Leona herself was a compact, practical woman of 50 with iron-gray hair and a manner that suggested she had strong opinions and had long since stopped being cautious about sharing them. She looked at Marin at the door. She looked at the children. She looked at Caleb Yazzie standing 2 steps behind, hat in hand. "3 children," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Marin said. "The baby stays quiet at night." "She does." "You got work." "I'm looking for it." Leona's gaze moved to Caleb. Something passed between them that Marin couldn't read, some species of old familiarity, the shorthand of people who have known each other a long time. Then Leona stepped back and held the door open. "The room at the back has 2 beds," she said. "Children in one, you in the other. Breakfast is at 7. I don't cook a second time for late risers." She paused. "Sweet rolls are on the table in the kitchen. Take some for the little ones before you go up." Marin stood in the doorway and felt something crack open in the middle of her chest. Something she hadn't known was still there to crack. "Thank you," she said, and her voice did not entirely hold steady. "Don't thank me yet," Leona said briskly, already walking away. "Thank me after you've slept in the bed." She got the children settled. Thomas was asleep before she finished pulling the blanket over him. Clara held on a beat longer, watching Marin with those serious gray eyes in the lamplight. "The man from the restaurant, she said. "Is he a friend?" "I don't know yet," Marin said. "He's been kind. He gave us his food." "He did." Clara thought about this. "Papa used to do that," she said. "Give things away when someone needed them." Marin smoothed her daughter's hair back from her forehead and did not trust herself to speak for a moment. "Get some sleep," she said finally. "Yes, ma'am." Clara closed her eyes. Then very quietly, "I think this place might be all right, Mama." Marin sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after the children slept, listening to the sounds of the house, settling around her, the wind outside, the distant sounds of the town. She thought about the 43 cents still in her pocket. She thought about a man who had given a stranger his supper without being asked and called it a loan so she wouldn't have to call it charity. She thought about Clara's voice saying, "I think this place might be all right." She didn't let herself believe it yet. Belief was a luxury she had learned to earn slowly. But she thought about it. In the morning she went to look for work. Red Bluff was not a generous town in that particular way of small towns that have seen too many people pass through with too many hard luck stories. The dry goods store owner told her he had all the help he needed. The woman who ran the millinery said the same with less politeness. The land office had a sign reading "Established Residents Only," and seemed to feel this was explanation enough. A man outside the livery told her that washing work might be found, but the woman who did the town's laundry had a cousin who wanted the extra jobs, so probably not. Marin thanked each of them and moved on. She was standing in front of the telegraph office, not because she had anyone to telegraph, but because she needed a moment out of the wind when she heard a voice behind her. "You're the woman from last night, the one Caleb Yazzie fed." She turned. The man was perhaps 50, well-dressed in the manner of someone who has money and wants you to know it, with a broad face and careful eyes. He was studying her the way a man studies a contract he suspects has a flaw in it. "I am," she said, "Marin Whitlow." "I know who you are." He didn't offer his own name. "I know why you came to Red Bluff, and I know you're in a difficult position." "I'm managing," she said. "Are you?" It wasn't a question. "You came here under an arrangement with Jeremiah Crow. Jeremiah is dead, which means the arrangement is dead. And you have—" His eyes moved to Clara standing beside her and Thomas a step behind. "Obligations." "I'm aware of my obligations," Marin said evenly. "I'm also aware that you haven't introduced yourself." A pause. "Elias Crow," he said. "Jeremiah's cousin." She kept her face still. "I see." "My cousin was a generous man," Elias Crow said. "Too generous sometimes. Made arrangements he shouldn't have. Left things less organized than they might have been." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I've taken over management of the estate. There are some loose ends that need addressing." "What kind of loose ends?" "Jeremiah may have made certain representations in his letters about arrangements about property." He extended the document toward her. "This simply clarifies that no formal agreement was in place, that any informal correspondence was preliminary and not binding. You sign this, and in recognition of the inconvenience of your situation, I'm prepared to offer you $50 to help with your travel back to Missouri." Marin looked at the document. She did not take it. "What does it say specifically?" "It says what I just told you." "Then you won't mind if I read it myself?" His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "Of course not." She took the document and read it. She read it carefully, the way her mother had taught her to read anything anyone wanted her to sign, which was read every word, read the spaces between the words, and read what isn't there as carefully as what is. What wasn't there was any acknowledgement that Jeremiah Crow had written her 37 letters over 8 months. What wasn't there was any mention of the 3 months of her savings she had spent preparing for this move. What wasn't there was any recognition that she had uprooted her children and traveled 1,000 miles on the strength of a man's written word and his written promise. What was there was a very thorough erasure of all of it. She folded the document and held it out to him. "No," she said. Elias Crow's careful eyes went very still. Mrs. Whitlow. No, she said again, and her voice was quiet and entirely steady. I won't be signing that. You should think carefully about your situation. I've been thinking carefully about my situation for 3 years, Mr. Crow. I'm quite practiced at it. She held the document until he took it. If there's nothing else? You're making a mistake, he said. I've made mistakes before. She took Clara's hand and looked at him directly. This isn't one of them. She walked away before he could answer, because she had learned that some conversations needed to end with you walking away, not with the other person letting you go. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, and her hands were not entirely steady, and she was furious in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Not the hot, desperate fury of someone who is losing, but the cold, clear fury of someone who has just decided not to lose. She was halfway down the block when she heard a voice. Mrs. Whitlow. She stopped, turned. Caleb Yazzie was crossing the street toward her, his long, easy stride crossing the distance, quickly, his eyes moving from her face to Elias Crow's retreating back, and then to her face again. I saw him approach you, he said. You all right? I'm fine, she said. And then, because he had fed her children and asked nothing in return, and she owed him honesty, at minimum, he wanted me to sign something, relinquishing any claim to Jeremiah's estate. Caleb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And I told him no. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved to Clara, who was watching him with those serious gray eyes unabashedly curious. He's going to come back, Caleb said. I expect so. When he does. He stopped, started again. You shouldn't be alone for that conversation. Marin looked at him. She had spent 3 years being careful about men who offered to help, because help often came with strings she couldn't afford to pay. She had learned to read the difference between genuine and transactional. She was reading him now, this quiet rancher who gave away his supper and called it a loan. And she found that what she read was uncomplicated, genuine. The simple goodwill of a person who has decided to give a damn and isn't looking for credit for it. I'll keep that in mind, she said. He nodded once. Then he looked at Clara. You like horses, young lady? Clara blinked. I don't know, she said carefully. I've never been close to one. He considered this. That's something that ought to be fixed. He touched the brim of his hat to Marin and kept walking. Clara watched him go. Then she looked up at Marin with an expression of great 7-year-old seriousness. He's a friend, she said, not a question. Marin watched Caleb Yazzie's retreating figure for a moment, his easy, unhurried walk, the way he moved through the town without noise or announcement, without demanding anything from anyone. He might be, she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said all day. She straightened her spine, took her daughter's hand, and turned back toward the rest of the block, toward the jobs that probably wouldn't come easy, and the man who would probably come back, and the town that hadn't decided yet what to make of her. Let them decide. She was still here. She intended to stay. The job at the laundry came from a woman named Dottie Furl, who ran the only proper wash house on the east end of Red Bluff, and who, as it turned out, did not have a cousin who wanted the extra work that had been the liveryman's assumption, and Dottie corrected it sharply when Marin appeared at her door the next morning with her sleeves already rolled. You done laundry work before? Dottie asked. I've done every kind of work there is, Marin said. Dottie looked her over the worn dress, the straight spine, the baby on her hip, and made a sound that was not quite approval, but was close to it. 6 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, 30 cents a day. Children stay out of the wash water. Yes, ma'am. You start today. I already started, Marin said, and reached for the nearest washboard. Dottie's mouth did something that might have been a smile. Fair enough. The work was brutal, in the way that honest physical labor is brutal. Her hands cracked by the end of the first day, her back screaming by the end of the second. But it was 30 cents a day, and it was hers. Leona watched the children in the mornings, in exchange for Marin helping with the rooming house's evening meals, which was an arrangement Leona presented as practical necessity and which Marin understood was kindness wearing practical necessity as a disguise. She didn't say so. She simply showed up in the kitchen at 5:30 every evening and made herself useful, and Leona accepted this without comment, and neither of them mentioned the word charity. It was on the fourth day that Elias Crow came back. She was hanging sheets in Dottie's yard when she heard the gate, and she turned to find him walking toward her with the particular deliberate pace of a man who has decided to be patient and wants you to know it costs him something. He was alone this time. No document in his hands that she could see, but she did not make the mistake of thinking that meant he'd come empty. "Mrs. Whitlow," he said. "Mr. Crow." She kept her hands moving on the sheet. She would not stop working for him. She would not give him even that. "I thought perhaps we'd gotten off on the wrong foot." "We got off on exactly the foot you intended," she said. "You came to erase me. I declined. That seems like a clear understanding, not a wrong foot." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him recalibrating. "You're a smart woman." "I'm an adequately smart woman," she said. "Smart enough. Then you know that Jeremiah's estate is complicated. There are debts, creditors. The property has claims against it that predate any correspondence he may have had." He paused. "The $50 I offered you was generous given that. You'd do well to reconsider." Marin pulled the sheet taut and pinned it. "What property?" A beat. "I beg your pardon. You said the property has claims against it. What property?" She turned and looked at him directly. "Because Jeremiah's letters mentioned the house, and the land, and the fact that the house was clear of debt. Those were his exact words. Clear of debt. He was quite specific." Elias Crow's careful eyes did something she had been watching for, a small, almost invisible tightening at the corners. "Correspondence isn't a legal document." "No," she agreed. "But 37 letters over 8 months, several of which include specific representations about the state of his property, paint a fairly detailed picture, and I kept every one of them." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. "You should be careful," Elias said quietly, "about making claims you can't support. And you should be careful," Marin said just as quietly, "about assuming that a woman alone with 3 children has nothing to fight with." She turned back to the laundry. "Good day, Mr. Crow." She listened to his footsteps retreat through the gate and stood with her hands braced on the line, and her eyes closed for exactly 5 seconds. Then she opened them and went back to work. She told Caleb that evening. He had taken to stopping by Hattie's around supper time, which was also when Marin sometimes stopped with the children after picking them up from Leona's, and this had become, without either of them formally arranging it, a kind of daily accounting. She told him what had happened, and he listened without interrupting, which was rarer in a man than it should have been. "He mentioned debts," Caleb said. "He did. There aren't any." He said it flatly, like a thing he knew the way he knew the weather. Jeremiah Crow was tight with money, irritatingly tight. He didn't owe anybody anything. I've done business with the man. Marin set her coffee cup down slowly. "Then why would Elias say, 'Because if you think there's nothing to claim, you walk away'?" He looked at her steadily. "The question is, what Jeremiah actually left behind, and whether Elias wants it bad enough to make your life difficult to get it." "How difficult?" she said. "That's what I'm trying to work out." Thomas chose this moment to knock over his water glass, and the conversation broke apart into the ordinary chaos of small children and soaked tablecloths. And by the time it was resolved, Clara was asking Caleb about the horses again. She had been asking him about the horses every time she saw him, with the patient persistence of a child who has decided she wants something and intends to wait you out, and he was answering her with the same unhurried seriousness he brought to everything. "Saturday," he said to Clara. "If your mama agrees, you can come out to the ranch and meet them." Clara turned to Marin with an expression of barely contained urgency. Marin looked at Caleb over her daughter's head. Something moved in her chest. The same cracking feeling she'd had in Leona's doorway, The particular tenderness of watching someone be kind to her children without making a performance of it. "Saturday," she said. Clara's whole face went brilliant. Marin lay awake that night listening to the house settle and running through the 37 letters in her mind, trying to remember every specific thing Jeremiah Crow had written about the property. The house, the land, the well that didn't run dry. He'd written about those things the way a man writes about what matters to him, not casually, but with a particular care, the way you describe something you've built and tended. She thought about what Caleb had said. Tight with money. Didn't owe anybody anything. She thought about Elias Crow's eyes doing that small tightening thing when she mentioned the letters. Something about this was bigger than she'd understood it to be. She didn't know yet what it was, but she knew the shape of people who were hiding something, and Elias Crow had that shape. She got up before dawn and wrote down everything she could remember from every letter in order as precisely as she could. It took 2 hours and filled 4 pages. When she was done, she folded them carefully and put them in the same place she kept the telegram, close, where she could find them in the dark. Saturday came with a hard blue sky and cold, bright air, and Caleb's ranch was 7 miles out of town on land that stretched wide and serious in every direction. Thomas talked the entire drive out a steady stream of questions about cows and horses and whether snakes could really get as big as what Billy Pruitt at the Mercantile had told him. And Caleb answered each question with the same patient attention. And Marin sat beside him on the wagon bench with Nora in her lap and watched her son talk a near stranger's ear off and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Safe. Not saved. Safe. There was a difference. The ranch itself was a working place, not pretty exactly, but solid. The kind of place built to last, rather than to impress. There was a main house, a bunkhouse, a barn, several outbuildings, and a foreman named Hatch, who greeted Caleb with a nod, and the children with the cautious courtesy of a man unaccustomed to children. The horses were in the corral, and Clara stood at the fence and stared at them with the absolute absorption of a child who has found the thing she didn't know she'd been looking for. "That one," she said, pointing at a bay mare standing apart from the others. "What's her name?" "Della," Caleb said. "She's looking at me." "She is." "Why?" "She's deciding about you," he said. "She does that with people. Figures out whether you're worth knowing." Clara absorbed this with great seriousness. "How do I show her I am?" "Stand still. Let her come to you." He paused. "Don't try to make her. She doesn't like being made." Clara stood very still. Marin watched her daughter stand there at the fence, small and patient and absolutely focused, and watched Della the mare take one slow step toward her, and then another, and then press her nose to the fence rail just within reach of Clara's outstretched hand. Clara made a sound, barely a sound, just a breath that Marin had never heard from her before. Something purely delighted, unguarded in a way that 7-year-olds usually were, but Clara hadn't been in a long time. Caleb had stepped back without Marin noticing and was standing beside her. They watched in silence for a moment. "She's good with her," he said quietly. "She's good with everything she cares about," Marin said. "She just doesn't let most things get close enough to see it." He didn't answer that, but she felt him turn to look at her briefly before turning back. It was later, when the children were in the barn with Hatch and the new litter of barn cats that had materialized with convenient timing, that Caleb said the thing he'd clearly been working up to. "I made some inquiries," he said, "about Jeremiah's estate." Marin looked at him. "The property is worth more than anyone's been saying out loud." He kept his voice level, matter-of-fact. "There's a water source on the eastern edge of the land, a creek that runs year-round. In this county, that's worth more than the house and the acreage put together. Half the ranchers in this valley have been quietly wanting that land for 2 years." The pieces rearranged themselves in Marin's mind. "And Elias has a buyer ready. Has had one ready, near as I can tell, before Jeremiah was even cold." He paused. "The question is whether Jeremiah made any provisions, whether there's a will, whether anything in those letters of yours constitutes a formal claim." He wrote that he intended to revise his will, Marin said slowly. "In the last letter, he said he had matters to settle, that he was putting things in order." The silence stretched. "Do you still have that letter?" Caleb asked. "I have all of them." He nodded once, and there was something in his face that was not quite anger, but was the careful cousin of it, a controlled, steady thing that she was beginning to recognize as his particular way of caring about something. He didn't rage. He just got very still and very focused, the way a man does when he's decided the matter is serious. "Then you need to talk to a lawyer," he said, "before Elias makes the next move." "I don't have money for a lawyer. I know a man in Dawson Creek. He owes me a favor." Marin looked at him for a long moment. The sun was dropping, throwing long shadows across the yard, and he was standing there in the cold air, talking about lawyers and favors with the same tone he'd used to tell her the beans were good at Hattie's. Like it was simply the next practical thing, and not a significant intrusion into her problem that she hadn't asked for. "You keep doing things," she said. "What things?" "Things you don't have to do. For someone you don't know." He looked at her steadily. "I know you well enough." "You've known me 6 days." "Some people you know in 6 days," he said. "Some people you know 6 years, and you still don't know them at all." He looked away toward the barn where the sounds of her children and the barn cats had gone cheerfully chaotic. "You're not hard to know, Mrs. Whitlow. You say what you mean and you do what you say. That's not complicated." Marin felt the back of her throat tighten in a way she would not allow to go further. "Most people would call it stubborn," she said. "Most people are wrong." She looked at him for another moment, this quiet, plain-spoken man, who gave things away, and called them loans, who listened without interrupting, who told her daughter to stand still and let things come to her. And she felt something she had been very careful not to feel, something she had wrapped up tight and put away after Daniel died, and told herself she didn't have room for any more. She felt the beginning of trust. Not gratitude, not relief. Trust. Which was an entirely different and considerably more dangerous thing. "All right," she said. The lawyer. Monday morning, Marin arrived at Dottie's wash house to find a woman waiting by the gate. She was perhaps 35, fine-featured, dressed well in the manner of someone whose money was relatively new, and she was looking at Marin with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. "You're Marin Whitlow," she said. "I am." "I'm Augusta Crow." A pause that carried its own meaning. "Elias's wife." Marin kept her face still. "Mrs. Crow." "I won't take much of your time." Augusta Crow's voice was precise and controlled the voice of a woman who has practiced saying difficult things without flinching. "I want you to know that I'm aware of my husband's approach regarding my cousin-in-law's estate. I don't share all of his views on the matter." "What views do you share?" Marin asked. Augusta blinked. Apparently she had expected something other than a direct question. "I think," she said slowly, "that Jeremiah was a fair man, and that fair men don't generally make promises they don't intend to keep." "He wrote to me for 8 months, Marin said. "He described his property. He described his intentions. He told me he was putting his affairs in order." She watched Augusta's face carefully. "Did you know about the letters?" "Elias mentioned them." "All of them?" The slightest hesitation. "He mentioned correspondence." "There are 37 of them," Marin said. "I've written down everything of substance that was in each one. Dates, specific statements, descriptions of the property." She let that sit for a moment. "Particularly the creek on the eastern edge of the land." Augusta Crow's composed expression did something complicated. It wasn't guilt exactly. It wasn't quite surprise either. It was the look of someone who has understood something and is deciding whether to say so. "My husband wants that land sold quickly," she said. "There are reasons for that that have nothing to do with you." "His debts," Marin said. Augusta's chin came up slightly. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." Marin tilted her head. "Why did you come here, Mrs. Crow?" "Not to warn me away. You could have let your husband handle that. Not to threaten me." "So why?" Augusta looked at her for a long measuring moment. Then she said quietly and precisely, "Because Jeremiah kept a journal, and I know where it is, and I think you should know that before my husband finds it first." The gate latch was cold under Marin's hand. She had not realized she'd reached for it. "Where?" she said. "The house," Augusta said. "His study, third drawer left side. He kept it locked, but the key—" She stopped. Started again. "Jeremiah gave me the key 2 weeks before he died. He said if anything happened, I'd know what to do with it." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Elias is moving faster than I expected, and because—" For the first time, Augusta's careful composure cracked just slightly, just at the edges. Jeremiah was a good man. He deserved better than to have everything he built picked apart by someone who never cared about any of it. She pressed her lips together. "You have until Thursday. That's when Elias intends to have the house cleared." She walked away before Marin could respond. Marin stood at the gate and watched her go, and felt the cold air moving around her, and understood that the ground she was standing on had just shifted in a way that she could not yet fully measure. She had until Thursday. She had until Thursday, and a key she didn't have yet, and a journal she hadn't read, and a man with debts and a buyer standing between her and whatever Jeremiah Crow had intended to leave behind. She pushed the gate open and went to work. She could not afford to think about it while she was working. She would think about it at 4 o'clock, and she would think clearly, and she would figure out the next step, the same way she had been figuring out the next step for 3 years, one at a time, in order without panic. But her hands shook for the first 20 minutes, and she let them shake, and then she made them stop. She found Caleb at the feed store on Birch Street, loading sacks into the back of his wagon, with the efficient, unhurried motion of a man who has done the same thing so many times, it requires no thought. She was out of breath not from the walk, but from holding everything in while she walked, and when he looked up and saw her face, he set the sack down immediately. "What happened?" he said. She told him. All of it, Augusta at the gate. The journal, the key. Thursday. She told it quickly and in order because she didn't have time for anything else, and he listened. The way he always listened, without moving, without interrupting his eyes on her face, and his expression doing the careful, controlled thing that she now knew meant he was angry. "Thursday," he said when she finished. "That's what she said. Today is Monday." He looked past her for a moment, working something out. "Elias will have somebody at the house. He doesn't leave things unattended when he's moving on them." Augusta said she has the key. That's not the problem. The problem is walking into Jeremiah's house to take something out of it, while Elias has a legal claim to be managing the estate. He looked at her. "If he catches you in there, he'll use it. He'll say you were stealing. He'll make that the story instead of whatever's in that journal." Marin felt the cold logic of it settle over her. "So we can't just go get it. Not without a witness. Not without somebody there who can say exactly what was taken, and why, and by whose authority." He was quiet for 3 seconds. "I'm going to get Ed Marsh." "Who is Ed Marsh?" "Leona's brother. He's the county recorder. He records deeds, wills, property transfers. If there's a journal that documents Jeremiah's intentions regarding his estate, Ed is the right person to be standing there when we open that drawer." He was already moving toward the wagon. "Come on. Now, we've got 3 days. I'd rather have 4. Ed Marsh was a thin, papery man who wore his authority so lightly you could almost miss it, and who listened to Caleb's explanation with the patience of someone accustomed to complicated situations arriving at his door. When Caleb finished, Ed looked at Marin over the tops of his spectacles. "You have the letters," he said, 37 of them, written out and documented. "And Augusta Crow is willing to produce the key and confirm the location of the journal." She said she would. Ed folded his hands on his desk. "Elias Crow has been pushing property transfers through this office faster than I'm comfortable with. 2 parcels last month, another one pending. The water rights question on the eastern acreage has been irregular." He said the word carefully. "If Jeremiah left documentation of his intentions, I want to see it. I want to see it before Elias does anything else with that estate." He stood up. "I'll go with you, tomorrow morning before the office opens. 8 o'clock. Marin exhaled. Mrs. Whitlow, Ed said, and there was something unexpectedly gentle in his voice for such a dry, precise man. Jeremiah Crow told me once that he was tired of his house feeling like a house and not a home. He said that in passing, the way people say things they mean more than they let on. He picked up his pen and went back to his papers. 8 o'clock. She slept badly. She kept running through contingencies. What if Augusta had changed her mind? What if Elias had already cleared the study? What if the journal said nothing useful? What if she had built a structure of hope on a foundation that would not hold? She was good at that particular kind of insomnia, the kind that moves through worst cases like a methodical accountant tallying catastrophes. At 3 in the morning, Nora woke and wouldn't settle, and Marin walked her in circles around the small room until the baby finally went slack against her shoulder, and she stood there in the dark with her youngest child's weight warm against her neck and thought about what Clara had said on the first night. "I think this place might be all right, Mama." She was going to make it all right. She didn't know yet exactly how, but she was going to. Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock, Marin stood in front of Jeremiah Crow's house, with Caleb on one side and Ed Marsh on the other, and Augusta Crow opened the door before they even knocked. Augusta looked like she hadn't slept either. She stood aside to let them in without speaking, and led them directly down the hall to the study, and stopped at the desk and looked at Marin. "If Elias finds out I did this," she said, he won't find out from me," Marin said. "Nor from me," Ed said. Augusta reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a small brass key. She held it out. Her hand was very steady, which Marin understood was costing her something. Marin took the key and opened the third drawer on the left. The journal was there. Brown leather, well-worn, the pages thick with use. Marin lifted it out with both hands and held it like it was something that might shatter. And then she opened it to the last entries, because that was where it would matter most, and she read. The room was completely silent. Jeremiah Crow's handwriting was small and precise, and a little old-fashioned, and in the last 2 weeks of his life, he had written with the particular clarity of a man who knows time is short. He had written about the property, the house, the land, the creek on the eastern edge, which he called by name, Sable Creek, year-round, clearest water in the county. He had written about his cousin Elias and the debts Elias had run up in Tulsa that Elias thought Jeremiah didn't know about. He had written about his intentions, and then he had written about Marin Whitlow. She had to stop reading for a moment. She had to look at the ceiling and breathe through her nose and refuse to do anything embarrassing in front of Ed Marsh and Caleb Yazzie and Augusta Crow, all of whom were watching her with varying degrees of restraint. "He named me," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "In the will. He revised it 6 days before he died. He named me and my children as his intended household. He wrote that in the event of his death, the house and the first 20 acres were to be held in trust for the Whitlow family, provided we'd arrived in Red Bluff in good faith." She looked up. He anticipated this. He anticipated Elias. Ed Marsh held out his hand for the journal without a word. He read the relevant pages with the focused attention of a man who is building a legal case in his head while he reads. Then he looked at Augusta. "You knew what was in here," he said. "I suspected," she said quietly. "Jeremiah told me he'd made provisions. He didn't tell me the specifics." "And you came to Mrs. Whitlow." "Because it was the right thing to do." Augusta said it simply without drama. "Elias is my husband, but Jeremiah was a good man, and what Elias is doing is not right, and I am not—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I am not willing to just stand there." Ed closed the journal and tucked it under his arm with the decisive movement of a man taking custody of evidence. "I'll need to file this at the county seat, today, before close of business." He looked at Caleb. "I'll need someone to ride with me." "I'll ride," Caleb said. "What do I do?" Marin asked. "You go to work," Ed said. "You go to work and you act like nothing has changed. If Elias comes to you today, you tell him nothing. If he asks about the journal, you don't know what he's talking about. And if he goes to the house before you file, then we move faster." He was already heading for the door. Let's move faster anyway. Elias came at noon. Marin was wrist-deep in wash water when she heard his boots on the path, and she kept working, kept her hands moving because that was what Ed had told her to do, and because she had decided to trust Ed Marsh's judgment in this, the same way she had decided to trust Caleb's carefully, with her eyes open, but genuinely. I hear you've been busy, Elias said. I've been working, she said. That's what I do. You've been talking to people you shouldn't be talking to. She looked up at him. His face was different today. The careful patience was gone, replaced by something tighter, less controlled. He'd heard something. She didn't know what, but he'd heard something. I talk to a lot of people, she said. This is a town. That's what people do in towns. Don't be clever with me, Mrs. Whitlow. His voice had dropped, and the drop was not a good sign. I know you went to the house this morning. Her stomach tightened. She kept her face still. I don't know what you're talking about. Augusta told me. She came to me an hour ago. He paused. She told me she'd made a mistake. Something cold moved through Marin. She did not let it show. She kept wringing out the shirt in her hands and thought Ed is riding. Caleb is with him. The journal is already out of the house. She thought those things and held on to them. Your wife can tell you whatever she likes, she said. I have work to do. The journal, Mr. Crow. She turned and faced him fully, and the shirt dripped onto the dirt between them. Whatever you're about to say, I'd think carefully before you say it. Because there are people in this town who know my name now, and they know yours, and they're paying attention. She held his gaze. That's all I'm going to say. He stared at her for a long moment, and she watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, the weighing, the measuring, the particular arithmetic of a man who is trying to figure out how much she knows and how much that knowledge can hurt him. She had seen that arithmetic before, in other men's faces, in other difficult moments. She knew what it looked like when it landed on uncertainty. He walked away. She turned back to the wash water, and her hands were shaking again, and she let them shake, and then she made them stop. Caleb came back at 6 o'clock. He came to Leona's house, knocked, and when Marin opened the door, he simply said, It's filed. She leaned against the doorframe. Augusta went to Elias. She told him we were at the house. His jaw tightened. It doesn't matter now. The filing is recorded. The journal is in county custody. Elias can't touch it. Can he still fight it? He can try. But the journal documents the revised will, and the revised will predates Elias's management claim by 4 days. Ed says Elias has been operating as if the original will was still in effect. He looked at her steadily. He's been managing estate property that legally belongs to you and your children. The words settled over her like something heavy and warm. She heard them. She let herself hear them. What does that mean practically? She said, for a woman with 43 cents and 3 children. The corner of his mouth moved. It means that Thursday, instead of Elias clearing the house, Ed Marsh is going to walk in there with the proper paperwork and change the locks. He paused. It means you have a house, Mrs. Whitlow, if you want it. She looked at him for a long moment in the doorway, with the sounds of her children coming from inside Clara's voice, and Thomas's laugh, and Nora's babble carrying down the hall, and she felt something she recognized as the specific terror of wanting something, and believing you might actually get it. That particular fear that comes not from loss, but from the nearness of not loss. What does Elias do next? She asked. I don't know. He's not a man who stops. But right now he doesn't have the legal ground he thought he had, and that limits him. Caleb was quiet for a beat. There's also the matter of the water rights. Ed found some irregularities in the transfer paperwork Elias was pushing through. There may be more to untangle than just your claim. How much more? Enough that Ed's already written to the Territorial Land Office. Marin pushed herself off the doorframe. She stood straight. She thought about Jeremiah Crow writing in his careful, small handwriting about Sable Creek and his intended household and his cousin Elias, and the debts Elias thought he didn't know about a dying man doing his meticulous, methodical best to set things right before he ran out of time. He was protecting me, she said. Before he ever met me. He just decided to protect me. That's the kind of man he was, Caleb said. Irritatingly careful and decent. He looked at her. He would have been glad you fought for it. I'm not done fighting. I know. He said it without hesitation, without surprise. He said it the way you confirm a thing you've already understood for some time. I know you're not. She nodded once. Then she asked the thing she'd been not asking for 2 days. Why are you doing this? Not the practical pieces. I understand the practical pieces. But why? She stopped, started again. You have a ranch. You have your own concerns. Elias Crow is not your problem. I am not your problem. He looked at her. The lamplight from the hall fell across half his face and left the other half in shadow, and he was quiet for long enough that she thought perhaps he wasn't going to answer. You walked into Hattie's that first night, he said, and you were hungry and you were scared and you sat down and you held your back straight and you divided that food between your children before you took a bite yourself. He paused. And I thought that's somebody worth knowing. That's somebody who deserves to have somebody in her corner. He looked away briefly. I'm not doing anything extraordinary, Mrs. Whitlow. I'm just not looking the other way. The hall behind her went suddenly louder. Thomas at a run, sock-footed, skidding on the wooden floor, grabbing the doorframe to stop himself. Mama Clara says it's almost bedtime, but I haven't had... He stopped, saw Caleb. His entire face changed. You're here. Did you bring Della? Della stays at the ranch, Caleb said. She'd be uncomfortable in town. Thomas considered this with great seriousness. But she'd be okay at night if you stayed in town because there's a stable. Thomas, Marin said. I'm just asking, Thomas said without apology. Caleb looked at Marin over her son's head, and this time the corner of his mouth did not just move, it actually became a smile. Brief and real, the kind that changed the whole shape of his face. She felt it somewhere in her sternum, like a struck match. She was still thinking about it when she lay awake at 11 o'clock after the children were sleeping and the house had gone quiet, running through what she knew, and what she didn't, and what came next. The house was real now. The filing was real. Jeremiah Crow's careful posthumous protection was real. And Elias Crow was still out there with his tight money and his waiting buyer and his peculiar fury at being outmaneuvered by a widow who'd arrived in his town with 43 cents and nowhere to go. She was nearly asleep when she heard a sound from outside, low and deliberate, not the usual settling sounds of the house. She lay still and listened. Boots on the porch, one person, stopping, then nothing. She was out of bed with her feet on the floor before she'd consciously decided to move, crossing to the window, looking out into the dark street. There was someone standing at the gate, facing the house, just standing there still as a post, and then as she watched, turning and walking away down the dark street without hurrying, without looking back. The shape of him, even in the dark, was familiar. Elias Crow didn't stop when things didn't go his way. Caleb had told her that. She'd believed it in the abstract. She believed it differently now, with her heart hammering and the cold coming up through the floor and her children sleeping 30 feet behind her. She went back to bed. She did not sleep. In the morning, she told Caleb. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. I'm going to talk to the sheriff, he said. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there. I know. He looked at her. That's the part that concerns me. Sheriff Dale Pruitt was a compact, deliberate man who had been keeping order in Red Bluff for 11 years, and who listened to Caleb's account of the previous night with the expression of someone sorting information into categories actionable, not actionable, and watch carefully. He was on the public street, Pruitt said, at 11 o'clock at night, standing at the gate of a house where a woman and 3 children are sleeping. Caleb kept his voice even. You know what that is, Dale. I know what it looks like. Pruitt turned his pen over in his fingers. I also know Elias Crow has been in this county a long time and has got friends who'd say I was overstepping if I went after him on the strength of standing on a public street after dark. I'm not asking you to arrest him. I'm asking you to know about it. Caleb leaned forward slightly. Because if something happens and you didn't know, that's a different conversation. Pruitt looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Marin, who had been sitting across from his desk with her hands folded and her back straight, letting Caleb do the talking, because she'd read the room and understood that Pruitt was the kind of man who responded better to a known quantity vouching for an unknown one than to an unknown one making her own case. "Mrs. Whitlow," he said, "you're the woman who's claiming Crow's estate." "Ed Marsh filed the documentation yesterday," she said. "It's not a claim, it's a recorded will." Pruitt's eyebrows moved slightly. Ed filed it himself. He rode to the county seat. He was there and back in a day. The sheriff was quiet for a moment, the pen going still. Ed Marsh's involvement clearly meant something to him, the weight of a man he trusted, stepping into the middle of this. "I'll have a word with Elias," he said finally. "Unofficial. A conversation between men who understand each other." He looked at Marin. "In the meantime, Mrs. Whitlow, I'd appreciate it if you didn't go anywhere alone after dark." "I have 3 children," she said. "I don't go anywhere alone after dark regardless." Something moved in Pruitt's face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the vicinity of one. "Fair enough." They walked out into the cold morning air, and Marin waited until they were half a block from the sheriff's office before she said what she'd been not saying since she'd told Caleb about the figure at the gate. "He's trying to frighten me," she said. "That's what last night was. Not a threat exactly. A reminder that he can be wherever he wants to be." "I know. It means the filing rattled him. It means he's running out of legal options and starting to think about other kinds." Caleb glanced at her. "Which means we need to move faster on the house." Thursday's lock change had been Ed's plan, deliberate and official. But if Elias was already standing at Leona's gate at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday, Thursday felt a long way off. "Can Ed move it up?" she asked. "I'll ask him today." "Today," she said. Not a question. A confirmation. She was learning that with Caleb, confirmations mattered. He didn't say things he didn't mean, and he didn't mean things he didn't follow through on. And knowing that was starting to feel like something she could build on the way you build on bedrock rather than soil. Ed moved it up. Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock, before most of Red Bluff was awake to watch, or comment, or go running to Elias Crow with news. Marin stood in the thin early light in front of Jeremiah Crow's house and watched Ed Marsh fit a new key to the lock and felt the peculiar weight of a door becoming yours. "You'll want to walk through," Ed said when the door swung open. "Inventory everything. Write it down, date. It'd have a witness sign it. If Elias claims later that anything was missing or taken before you moved in, you want a record." "I'll witness it," Caleb said. They walked through the house together. Marin moved through each room quietly noting what was there, and Caleb walked a half step behind her with a pen and paper Ed had given him, and neither of them said much that wasn't practical. The house was solid, clean, modest. The study where they'd found the journal still had the faint presence of the man who'd sat in it, a pair of spectacles on the desk, a stack of correspondence, a coffee cup not quite cleaned. Marin picked up the spectacles without thinking, held them for a moment, then set them back down with care. "He was a real person," she said quietly. "He was," Caleb said. "I keep thinking of him as a transaction, a business arrangement. And then I'm in his house, and there are his spectacles, and I remember he was a real person who lived here." She paused. "He chose me. He read my letter and chose me and my children, and then he died before we ever got here." Caleb didn't say anything. He didn't offer comfort or platitude, which was exactly right. He just stood there and let the moment be what it was, and that was better than anything he could have said. She squared her shoulders. "Let's finish the inventory." They were nearly done when they heard the front door. Marin stepped into the hall and stopped. Elias Crow stood in the doorway. He hadn't knocked. He'd simply walked in the way a man walks into a place he still believes is his by right. And he stood there taking in the scene, Marin Caleb Ed Marsh with his official papers, the new key on the hall table, and his face went through something rapid and not pleasant. "What is this?" he said. "Good morning, Elias." Ed's voice was entirely calm. "The estate transfer is recorded, and the property is now formally in the custody of Mrs. Whitlow pending full legal settlement. I've changed the locks. You'll need to return any keys you have to this office by end of business Friday." "You can't." "I can," Ed said. "And I have. The documentation is at the county seat, and a copy is on file in my office. If you'd like to contest it, you're welcome to retain a lawyer. That's your right." He paused. "But you are standing in Mrs. Whitlow's house without her invitation. I'd suggest you address that." Elias's eyes moved to Marin. They were not afraid exactly, but they were calculating in a new way, reassessing, measuring the distance between where he'd expected to be and where he was. She held his gaze without shifting. "You think you've won something," he said to her. "I think I'm standing in a house that a decent man left to me and my children," she said. "I think I'm going to sweep it out and move my family in and cook supper in that kitchen and wake up tomorrow morning. That's what I think." "This isn't finished." "No," she agreed. "Probably not, but it started." He left. He walked out without another word, without slamming the door, without any of the dramatic exits she might have expected from a man who'd just watched his plan come apart. He simply left, which was in some ways more unnerving than fury. A furious man shows you where he is. A quiet one doesn't. He'll come back at it through the water rights. Ed said the moment the gate closed. "That's where the real money is. The house and the 20 acres are yours because Jeremiah's will is clear. But the creek and the water rights have more complicated title history, and Elias has already made some moves in that direction." "How complicated?" Caleb asked. "Complicated enough that I've written to Judge Harlow in Dawson Creek. We need a formal hearing, which means—" Ed looked at Marin. "This isn't over in a week. This may take months." "Then it takes months," she said. Ed nodded. He seemed to approve of her in his dry paperwork-flavored way. "Move your family in today. Don't wait. Presence matters in these things." She moved them in that afternoon. It didn't take long. Their belongings were few, but the moment was larger than its logistics suggested. Leona helped carry things unbothered and efficient, refusing sentimentality while being sentimental in every practical gesture, including a wrapped package that turned out to contain 3 jars of preserves and a small quilt she'd made herself. "For the baby," Leona said about the quilt. "I had the fabric. It was sitting there doing nothing." "Leona, don't," Leona said firmly. "I didn't ask for commentary." Marin pressed her lips together against a smile. "Yes, ma'am." Clara stood in the doorway of what would be her room, hers and Thomas's, and looked around with a seriousness that was almost adult. Then she went to the window and looked out at the yard. Then she looked back at Marin. "This is ours," she said. "For now," Marin said. "We're working on making it permanent. But for now it's ours. For now it's ours." Clara nodded once with the decisive finality of someone who has filed a piece of information and moved on. "I'm going to put my things in that corner," she said, pointing. Thomas was already running from room to room, conducting his own investigation, which appeared to involve testing the echo quality of each space by calling out at various volumes. Nora, deposited on the kitchen floor with a wooden spoon and a pot lid that Leona had brought, was conducting her own investigation along similar lines and considerably louder. Marin stood in the kitchen of Jeremiah Crow's house and listened to her children fill it with noise, and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Not safe exactly, not secure. Something more fragile and more real than either of those. Something that said here, "This is here, and you are in it." She had to go back to work the next morning. The house was hers to live in, not hers to stop working in. She had the lawyer in Dawson Creek to prepare for which cost money, and the children to feed which cost money, and the small daily arithmetic of survival to maintain, regardless of what Jeremiah's journal had said about her children's future. Dottie's wash house did not pause for legal victories. But that evening when Caleb came by, he had been coming by in the evenings, a pattern that had established itself without announcement, and which neither of them had addressed directly. She cooked supper. An actual supper, at an actual table, in an actual kitchen, with her own children at it. Beans and salt pork and cornbread, nothing elaborate but done properly and with attention. She set a place for him without asking. He sat down without making a thing of it. Thomas talked about the barn cats, and Clara talked about Della and Nora, threw cornbread off her tray with scientific consistency. And Caleb answered Thomas's questions and asked Clara things about the mare that showed he had been paying attention to what Clara cared about. And Marin moved between the table and the stove and thought, "This is a thing. This is a real thing that is happening." After the children were in bed, she poured 2 cups of coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, and she asked him the question she'd been not asking. "What does Elias do next, your real read? Not the reassuring version." He looked at her over his cup. He didn't insult her by giving her the reassuring version. "He can't touch the house." Ed's locked that down tight. The water rights question is different. There are 3 other landowners who have partial claims to Sable Creek going back to before Jeremiah bought the land. Elias has been quietly buying up those claims. If he gets enough of them, he can argue the creek title is contested enough that Jeremiah's estate can't assign it to you. Can he win that argument? It depends on Judge Harlow. Harlow is a fair man. But fair men still need solid evidence, and evidence costs time to assemble. He set his cup down. There's something else. One of the claims Elias has been buying it originally belonged to a man named Sutton. Charlie Sutton. He sold it to Elias 3 months ago before any of this started. He paused. Charlie Sutton died 2 weeks later. Fell from his horse. The kitchen was very quiet. "You think it wasn't an accident?" she said. "I don't know what it was. Neither does anyone else. Charlie was 64, and that horse had been giving him trouble for years." He looked at her steadily. "But I think about it." Marin thought about the figure at the gate. Elias Crow standing in the dark, not doing anything, just standing there. "He wants the water," she said. "The water is worth more than everything else combined. Whoever controls Sable Creek controls the water supply for half the ranches in this valley. That includes mine." He said it plainly. "I have a stake in this beyond you and your children, Mrs. Whitlow. I want you to know that. I'm not purely altruistic." She looked at him. "You told me that so I wouldn't find it out later and feel I'd been managed." "Yes, I appreciate that." She considered. "It doesn't change anything. Your stake and my stake point the same direction. That's not a conflict." "No," he said. "It isn't, Caleb." It was the first time she'd used his given name without the formal address. She saw him register it just slightly. "Whatever comes next, I need to know you're not going to step back from this if it gets harder than you expected. Not because I need rescuing, I don't, but because I'm building something here, and I can't build it on ground that shifts." He held her gaze without hesitation. "I'm not going anywhere." "People say that. I know." He didn't flinch. "I'm saying it anyway. And I'll say it again in 6 months if you need me to." She believed him. She believed him not because she was naive or desperate, but because she'd been reading him for 2 weeks with everything she had, and nothing she'd read had contradicted it. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. She was still thinking about it when the knock came. Not the front door, the back door. 3 knocks, quick and low and deliberate. Caleb was on his feet before she moved one hand raised to tell her to stay back, crossing to the back door with the particular careful quiet of a man who knows how to move when something is wrong. He opened the door. Augusta Crow stood in the dark, coatless, her hair down her face, holding an expression that went well past frightened and into something rawer. "He knows," she said. "About the journal. About all of it. He knows I helped you and he—" She stopped, swallowed. "He went out an hour ago. He has 2 men with him. I don't know where they're going, but I heard him say the ranch." She looked at Caleb. He said something about making sure certain people understood the cost of interfering. The color dropped out of Caleb's face in a way Marin had not seen before. Not fear exactly, but something very close. The fear not for himself, but for what he'd left unattended. "Hatch," he said. "My foreman, he's alone out there." He was already moving toward the door, reaching for his hat. His whole body shifted into that controlled, urgent motion. He stopped and turned to Marin. "Lock this door," he said. "Both doors. Don't open them for anyone until you hear my voice. You understand?" "Go," she said. "Marin." "I understand. Go." He went. She locked both doors and turned to find Augusta still standing in the kitchen, hugging her own arms. And Marin looked at the woman who had turned on her, and then turned back and decided that was a conversation for later. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." "How are you so calm?" Augusta said. Marin filled the pot and set it on the stove and looked at the back door and thought about Caleb riding 7 miles in the dark toward men who'd been sent to make a point. "I'm not calm," she said. "I'm just not letting it have me yet." The coffee boiled and they drank it, and the clock on the mantel moved with the specific cruelty of clocks in moments when time matters, and Marin sat with her hands wrapped around her cup and her eyes on the door and told herself what she had been telling herself for 3 years in all the moments that asked her to come apart. Not yet. Not yet. Hold on just a little longer. An hour passed. Then she heard hoofbeats on the road outside, more than one horse coming fast and then slowing, and she was at the front window before the sound fully resolved, looking out into the dark. 2 horses, Caleb's bay, and another one she didn't recognize. Caleb was in the saddle, upright, moving. That was what she needed to know first. He was upright and moving. The second rider was Hatch, the foreman, who had a dark stain down the left side of his shirt that she could see even in the lamplight from the window. She had the front door open before either of them dismounted. "How bad?" she said. "Knife," Caleb said, and his voice was taut in a way she hadn't heard before. "He'll need the doctor. It's manageable. But he needs the doctor. Go get him. I'll stay with Hatch." "You don't have to, Caleb." She looked at him directly. "Go get the doctor. I've got him." He looked at her for one beat. Something moved in his face, something she didn't have a name for yet but intended to learn. Then he turned his horse and rode. She got Hatch inside and onto the kitchen bench and got his shirt off and found a wound that was ugly but not mortal, and she pressed a clean cloth to it with both hands and held it there and told Hatch to keep still and keep talking, because she'd learned that men who were talking were men who hadn't decided to give up. "What did they want?" she asked him. Hatch's face was gray, but his voice was steady. "Told me to tell Caleb to step back from the crow business, that the water rights were none of his concern." He paused. "I told them where they could put that advice." "Is that when they cut you?" "After," he said. "I may have elaborated." Augusta, from the corner where she'd been standing very still, said quietly, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know he'd go this far." Hatch looked at her. "You're Elias's wife." "I am." He thought about this. Then, "You came to warn them." "Yes." He said. And then, because he was bleeding on Marin's kitchen bench and she was pressing a cloth to his side, and she had 3 children sleeping upstairs, and it was the middle of the night, and she was still steady and present and getting it done. "You're going to be all right, ma'am, the lot of you. I've been riding for Caleb Yazzie 12 years. That man doesn't stop either." Marin kept pressure on the wound and didn't let herself feel anything yet. The doctor would come. Caleb would come back. In the morning, there would be a sheriff's conversation that looked very different now than it had this morning. Elias Crow had just made a mistake. He'd moved from standing at gates and pressuring widows into something Sheriff Pruitt could not categorize as standing on a public street. She understood that clearly, and she filed it away for morning. For now, the cloth, the pressure, the man bleeding on her bench, the clock moving. She held on. She had always been good at holding on. The doctor came at midnight, a tired, competent man named Fielding, who asked no unnecessary questions and stitched Hatch's side with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this kind of work in this kind of town for a long time. He told Hatch to stay off a horse for a week, and told Marin to keep the wound clean, and told Caleb, who had returned while Fielding was still working, that his foreman was lucky, and that whoever had held the cloth for 40 minutes had done it right. Caleb looked at Marin when Fielding said that. She was standing at the stove with her back to the room washing her hands, and she didn't turn around, but she felt his gaze. The way you feel warmth from a fire, not the source itself, just the reach of it. When Fielding left, Caleb walked Augusta Crow to the door. "Where will you go?" he asked her. "My sister's," Augusta said, "in Dawson Creek. I've been thinking about going for some time." She stopped in the doorway and looked back at Marin. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry for the morning I went to Elias. I panicked. I've been panicking for a long time where he's concerned, and I—" She stopped, started again. "I should have been braver sooner." "You were brave when it counted," Marin said. "That's not nothing." Augusta looked at her for a moment with an expression that held both gratitude and a kind of grief. The grief of a woman recognizing too late what it looks like when someone handles fear with their back straight. Then she nodded once and walked out into the night. Hatch was asleep on the kitchen bench, which he'd refused to give up in favor of the spare room, claiming that the bench suited him fine and that he'd slept in worse locations, a statement Marin chose not to examine too closely. Caleb sat across the table from her, and they were quiet for a moment, in the particular way of people who have just moved through something difficult together, and have not yet found the right entry point into what comes next. "You need to go to Pruitt tonight," she said. "Not in the morning." "I know." "2 men, a knife, and your foreman's blood. That's not a conversation about standing on public streets anymore." "No," he said. "It isn't." He didn't move yet. He looked at her across the table with that steady, unhurried attention she had come to know. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." Marin. It was the first time he'd used her given name without the formal address, and she felt it land the way his gaze had landed earlier, just the reach of it, warm and precise. "I'm scared," she said. "I'm scared, and I'm angry, and I'm very tired, and I'm going to feel all of those things tomorrow when there's time for them. Right now, I need you to go to Pruitt." He stood. He put on his hat. He stopped at the door. "I'll be back before morning." "I know," she said. And she did know. That was the thing. She knew it the way she knew the weight of Nora in her arms, the sound of Clara's voice, the feel of the floor under her feet. She knew it as a true thing, settled and certain. He went. She sat in the kitchen and listened to Hatch breathe, and the house settle, and the clock move, and let herself have the fear for exactly 10 minutes, feeling the full shape of it. The men in the dark, the knife. What could have been different if Hatch had been a step slower, if Augusta had come an hour later, if Caleb hadn't gotten there in time? She let herself have all of it, and then she put it away. She had children to raise. She had a house to keep. She had a water rights hearing to prepare for and a life to build. She made a fresh pot of coffee and started writing down everything she remembered about the night the knock. Augusta's face, what she'd said the time, the detail of the wound, because Ed Marsh had told her to document everything, and she had learned to take Ed Marsh's advice. Caleb came back at 3 in the morning. Pruitt had gone out with 2 deputies. By morning, both men who'd been at the ranch were in the jail, a pair of drifters Elias had hired through an intermediary, which was meant to provide distance, but didn't provide nearly enough. One of them talked before noon. Elias Crow was arrested on Thursday. He was out on bail by Friday, which was how these things worked. But he was out on bail with a criminal charge against him in a county where he'd been trying to move property and water rights through official channels, and those channels had abruptly become considerably less cooperative. The buyer for Sable Creek evaporated. People who had been quietly helping Elias manage the estate paperwork began remembering prior commitments. Ed Marsh filed 3 separate challenges to property transfers that had gone through his office in the previous 2 months, and the Territorial Land Office responded to his earlier letter with a formal inquiry. Elias Crow was not ruined. Marin was realistic enough not to expect ruin, but he was contained, and contained was enough. Contained meant he couldn't move forward. Contained meant the pressure that had been building since the moment she'd walked into Red Bluff had somewhere to release itself that wasn't her and her children. She kept working at Dottie's wash house. She kept cooking supper every evening. She kept showing up in the particular visible way that a woman alone with children needs to show up in a small town, present, consistent, unashamed, until the look she got on the street changed their character. Not all of them. Some people in Red Bluff had made up their minds about who she was and were not inclined to revise. But enough of them. Enough that when she walked into the general store with Thomas on her hip, the man behind the counter said good morning, the way you say good morning to someone who belongs there. That was not nothing. That was in fact almost everything. The hearing before Judge Harlow was set for the second week of April. Ed had spent 6 weeks building the case. The letters, the journal, the testimony of 3 people who had known Jeremiah Crow and could speak to his intentions, the documentation of Elias's irregular property moves. Caleb had provided a sworn statement about the water rights and the creek's importance to the surrounding ranches. Augusta from Dawson Creek had sent a written account of what she knew about Elias's debts and his plans for the estate. Marin did not have a lawyer. The man in Dawson Creek that Caleb had mentioned, the one who owed him a favor, had agreed to advise her but had not been able to appear in person. So she sat at the table in Judge Harlow's courtroom with Ed Marsh beside her, and her 37 letters stacked in a neat pile, and she stated her case herself. She had practiced for 2 weeks. She had stood in her kitchen, Jeremiah's kitchen, her kitchen, and said it out loud precisely and without emotion, because emotion in this context was a vulnerability she couldn't afford. She had practiced the way she did laundry repetitively until it was clean. When the moment came, she was ready. Judge Harlow was a lean, silver-haired man with the face of someone who had heard a great many stories and learned to look past the surface of them. He listened to everything. He read selected passages of the journal. He reviewed Ed's documentation. He heard Elias's lawyer argue that a widow who had never met Jeremiah Crow had no claim to an estate she'd come to under an informal agreement. Then he asked Marin one question. "Did you come to Red Bluff in good faith, Mrs. Whitlow?" "Yes, sir," she said. "I gave up my home. I used my savings. I brought my children 1,000 miles on a man's written word because he gave that word in good faith, and I had every reason to believe he meant it. I came in good faith." Harlow was quiet for a moment. "I believe you did," he said. And that was essentially that. The ruling came 3 days later. The house and 20 acres hers. Sable Creek and the water rights held in a county trust, pending a full audit of all competing claims, which would take time, but which effectively blocked Elias from selling anything. The charges against him in connection with Hatch's attack were separate, and those ground forward through their own slow legal machinery, but the property question was settled. She was standing in her kitchen when Ed Marsh brought her the papers. She read them twice standing at the table, and then she sat down and read them a third time. "It's done," she said. "This part," Ed said. "The water rights will take another few months to fully settle. But the house is yours and no one can touch it. Your children's future is on solid ground." He set his hat on the table and looked at her with his dry, paperwork-flavored regard. "Jeremiah would be pleased, I think. He liked things done properly." "He did," she said. "I feel like I know him even now." "You do," Ed said. "You knew his word. That's the best part of a person to know." She found Caleb at the corral at his ranch that afternoon. She hadn't told him she was coming, just saddled the horse she'd been learning to handle Clara's influence as it turned out. It was impossible to watch your daughter fall in love with horses without it becoming contagious and ridden out. He was working with a young gelding patient and methodical, the way he was with everything, and he turned when he heard her coming and waited. She dismounted and walked to the fence and held out the papers without saying anything. He took them and read. She watched his face move through it, the careful attention, the recognition, and then something that was not quite relief, but was the cousin of it. He handed the papers back. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. The meals and the lawyer and Pruitt and the ride in the dark and—" She stopped. There was too much to name, and naming it made it smaller. "Just thank you." "You did the work," he said. "We did the work," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The gelding moved behind him, and he put a hand out without looking to steady it, automatic and easy, the gesture of a man so used to managing the things in his care that it required no thought. She had been watching him manage the things in his care for 2 months. She had watched him do it quietly and without announcement, without expectation of acknowledgement, because that was simply who he was, a man who looked after what was his, and somewhere along the way had apparently decided that she was his to look after. She wanted to tell him that she had noticed every single bit of it and had been filing it away like Jeremiah's letters, like Ed's paperwork carefully with full attention, because some things deserve that. "I want to say something," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything practical." He waited. "I came to Red Bluff with 43 cents and 3 children and nothing else, and the first person in this town who treated me like someone worth treating well was you. You didn't make a show of it. You didn't ask anything back. You just did it. And then you kept doing it." She kept her eyes on him. "I don't need to be saved, Caleb. I've been saving myself for 3 years, and I know how. But there is something different about having someone beside you while you do it. Someone who isn't going to leave when it gets harder." She paused. "I'm not a woman who says things she doesn't mean. So when I tell you that the past 2 months with you in them have been better than the 3 years before them, I need you to understand that I mean it exactly." The gelding bumped his shoulder. He didn't look away. "I'm not easy," she said. "I'm stubborn, and I argue, and I don't ask for help even when I should, and I have 3 children who will interrogate you about horses and barn cats at length." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you the whole of it. I know the whole of it." He moved, then came forward, unhurried, the way he did everything, and stopped at the fence rail between them, close enough that she could have reached across the rail and touched him. "I was going to have this conversation with you after the hearing. I didn't want you thinking it was mixed up with everything else." "What conversation?" "The one where I tell you that I'm not doing any of this because I feel sorry for you, or because I have a stake in the water rights, or because I'm a decent man who looked the other way once and can't do it again." He held her gaze. "I'm doing it because I watched you walk into Hattie's that night and divide your food before you ate a bite of it, and I thought there is a woman I want to know for the rest of my life. And the last 2 months haven't changed that. They've made it clearer." The silence between them was not empty. It had weight and warmth, and the kind of earned quality that only comes from things actually worked for. "You should know," she said, "that Clara has already decided you're hers." "I know. She told Della." Marin laughed a real laugh, sudden and full, the kind she hadn't had in so long it surprised her coming out. "She told the horse. She said it to Della's face very seriously while they were doing whatever they do together out there. She said, 'Caleb is going to be ours, and you'll like having us here.'" He paused. Della seemed to agree. Marin shook her head, still smiling. "She's 7. She has absolutely no respect for other people's private business." "She's right, though," he said. She looked at him. "She's right," he said again, quiet and plain. "If you'll have me." She thought about the night she'd arrived. The platform, the cold, the 43 cents, the telegram folded soft at the creases. She thought about pushing open Hattie's door with 3 hungry children behind her, swallowing everything that wanted to come apart, holding her back straight, because that was the only thing she had full control of. She thought about Jeremiah Crow writing in his careful handwriting about a household, about putting things in order, about a woman he'd never met whose letter had told him something true. She thought about Clara in the doorway of her room saying, "This is ours." "Yes," she said. "I'll have you." He put his hand over hers on the fence rail. That was all just his hand over hers, warm and unhurried. No performance in it, nothing asked back. Just the simple declared fact of it. They stood there, while the wind moved around them, and the gelding made a low sound behind Caleb, and somewhere across the pasture a hawk turned in wide, slow circles in the cold blue sky. Spring came to Red Bluff the way it always does in high country towns, without ceremony, without asking permission. Just one morning warmer than the last, until suddenly the cold released, and the ground turned soft, and things began. Marin planted a kitchen garden along the south side of the house, seeds she'd bought from the general store, where the man behind the counter now said, "Good morning," the way you say it to someone who belongs. Clara helped with the planting, the way she helped with everything, completely focused, deeply serious. Asking questions about each seed, as if she intended to be personally responsible for its survival. Thomas helped by providing enthusiastic running commentary and occasionally getting in the way. Nora sat on a blanket nearby and ate a small amount of dirt and was discouraged from eating more. Dottie had offered Marin more hours. Marin had taken half of them and turned the other half toward the house, toward the children, toward learning the particular rhythms of a life that was hers and not borrowed, not provisional, not held together with 43 cents and sheer will. It still required will. She was realistic enough to know it always would. The water rights hearing had not fully resolved. There were still months of legal untangling ahead, and Elias Crow was still in the county, quieter now, but not gone, a man who had been contained, but not changed. The world did not cooperate with clean endings. She had stopped expecting it to, but she had a house with her name on it. She had children who ran through its rooms. She had a kitchen garden coming up from the ground that she had planted with her own hands. She had a man who rode out 7 miles in the dark without hesitating when it mattered, and then came back and sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee and talked about ordinary things, as if ordinary things were exactly where he wanted to be. On an evening in late April after supper, after the children were in bed, she sat on the front step of Jeremiah's house, her house, and looked out at the town in the last of the light. Caleb sat beside her. They weren't talking, just sitting in the easy quiet of people who have discovered they are comfortable in each other's silence, which is rarer and more valuable than comfort in each other's noise. Clara appeared in the doorway behind them, barefoot, squinting in the fading light. "Is Caleb staying?" she said. "Go to bed, Clara," Marin said. "I'm just asking." "Bed." Clara looked at Caleb. "You should stay," she said. "It's your supper table, too. Mama made enough." "She always makes enough," Caleb said gravely. "I know." Clara nodded with immense satisfaction, as if this settled the matter, and went back inside. Marin pressed her lips together. "She's not wrong," Caleb said. "She knows she's not wrong. That's the problem." Marin looked at him. The light was low and amber, and the town was settling into evening around them, and she felt something she had not let herself feel in so long that she'd almost forgotten its shape. Not just safe, not just steady. Something warmer and more specific than either of those, something that had her name on it the same way the house did now. She had come to Red Bluff with nothing. She had come broken and alone and burning through the last of her reserves. She had come because a man she'd never met had given her his word, and she had honored it by showing up. And in showing up, she had found a house and a town, and a man who gave away his supper and called it a loan so she wouldn't have to call it charity. She had not been rescued. She had not been saved. She had walked in through the door that was offered and done the work of staying, and that was the whole of it, the plain and unembroidered truth. She had stayed. She had held on. She had built something one day at a time, from 43 cents and 3 children and a back that refused to bend. The garden was coming up. The house was hers. Her children were asleep inside it. And beside her, steady as bedrock, was a man who had decided she was worth knowing for the rest of his life, and had not yet found a reason to change his mind. Marin Whitlow had come to Red Bluff with nothing, and she had made it into everything she needed with her own 2 hands in her own time on her own terms. And that was something no one would ever take from her again.
Are pretty popular. I mean, not pretty, they're pretty pricey, they're like minimum price, like $40 for a mug. And I'm like, I don't think I'm definitely not there yet at all. I think the most I would price one at is like maybe 25. Booty toothbrush holder, pen or other holder. Ooh, that's an idea. I could look into that. But look, here's the thing. I've got 50 pounds, well, give or so. I think it's more like 45 pounds now of clay that I can make stuff with. So that will be our side quests for sure. I'm definitely going to be opening a 4th wall to sell that. I'm just not sure I'll discuss the pricing. I think I'm going to have to discuss the pricing with ceramicists and stuff like that. And then, the process of that whole, shipping it out to people, yada, yada. So But I definitely want to level up in my pottery.